Hello, Western Standard viewers. I'm Nigel Hannaford, opinion editor for the Western Standard. I have with me today Shaun Polczer, our energy editor, who is occupying an increasingly important role in our news coverage. There is so much happening in his department. Shaun, last week, Enercan Minister Jonathan Wilkinson met with Premier Smith and announced the first piece of legislation in what appears to be the just transition, that massive and planned reduction of Alberta's energy industry and the replacement of high-paying jobs for energy workers with lower-paying jobs for, truck drivers and janitors, was what was in the briefing notes given to the minister. Wilkinson said in that visit that worldwide oil demand was going to be down to 25 million barrels a day by 2050. Right now, it's about, you know better than I, but I believe it's about 100, 101, 102 million barrels a day. So he's talking about a 75% reduction. And then yesterday, in your story in the Western Standard, the people from OPEC and Aramco were saying something very different, like 4 times as much, 110 million barrels a day. How can they be so far apart on this? What's going on?
That's a really good question, Nigel. Well, the Canadian government is using the International Energy Agency numbers, and I think at the time I called it the unicorn scenario. And what's happening in Malaysia is Petronas is holding a global oil conference with the OPEC fellows. So Secretary General of OPEC, Haytham Ghais, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but yeah, the long-term OPEC forecast out to, this one is to 2045, is 110 million barrels a day, which they would amounts to about a 15% increase. And I think that was the number that I used last week after
I believe it
Wilkinson met with Smith. Aramco Chairman Amin Nasser gave a speech and basically said that net zero is a fanciful, quote unquote, fanciful concept. Even the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and Malaysia is a major liquefied natural gas exporter. They also have 20% of the LNG Canada project in Kitimat, basically said that it would be foolish to sacrifice economic growth for net zero goals.
So where does that 25 million, which is clearly so at odds, come with? You referred to a scenario, but I mean, is this by guess and by golly? Are there other scenarios?
Well, the IEA put out 3 scenarios. So the
IEA is the International Energy Agency
based in Paris.
Based in Paris. That's not the American.
The American is the Energy Information Agency,
right?
EIA.
Okay, so we're talking about
based in Washington.
The Paris boys. Yes.
Yeah. So they put out 3 scenarios. The first, the 24 million barrels, actually, where that comes from is if the world were to reach net zero by 2050.
That's with everybody wanting to and doing everything that they could.
That they would need to get to that point.
So how likely is that?
Slim to none.
Okay. How likely do you think the Aramco estimate is? The 110 million barrels a day. Is that realistic?
Well, basically when OPEC speaks, it basically is Saudi, the Kingdom of Saudi speaking, because OPEC basically is Saudi. As we all know, they are extremely shrewd businessmen, and they are not very often wrong. So I would say that 110 is probably realistic. The EIA, the American in administration, they've predicted about 110 as well. So those numbers are quite in the ballpark. They're quite aligned.
So not to be unpatriotic or anything, but there's something very clearly wrong with the Canadian estimates, or alternatively, they are planning a reduction in Canada's energy industry, quite unlike anything that we have seen before, and completely at odds with what the rest of the world is doing. Is that a fair way to assess it?
Yes.
Okay.
What they're assuming is massive uptake in EVs. And, here again, we've got the chairman of Toyota, we've got the auto manufacturers themselves saying that the biggest barrier to the take-up in electric vehicles that they are envisioning is basically the lack of charging infrastructure.
Yeah, and the lack of heavy-duty lines to take the current from wherever it's produced to wherever it's needed and to be distributed through the neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
Yes. Look, Minister Wilkinson is apparently back this week making another round of announcements. What can you tell us about that?
Well, today they're handing out $1.5 million to forest product manufacturer in Ottawa, presumably to clean up their operations. Tomorrow he's
Clean up in the sense of what? Electrify them?
They're coming up with different processes for pulp and paper, the craft pulp mills, and
So
they've been making some announcements in the interior of BC and through. So it's just kind of part of that whole thing. Tomorrow he's in BC announcing regional roundtables. Sounds like with First Nations leaders, Aboriginal representation.
So is this to do with that Canadian sustainable jobs strategy that he announced here last week?
I believe it is.
Yeah. So this is the first stage in that.
Yeah, I think it's they're going to spell out what the Aboriginal representation is going to be on these committees, I guess, as a first step. And then on Wednesday, he's in Regina making announcements about the Saskatchewan power grid. And that's where Premier Moe has basically said, you know, take it or leave it. We're not going off coal, no matter what.
Come and get me.
Come and get me.
Yeah.
Arrest me. Yeah.
Well, what a great campaign slogan. Look, I can't help, you know, when I read your stuff, Shaun, and I talk to the people that I know, I can't get away from the feeling that there's a hammer being forged that's getting ready to drop on Alberta. Can you give me some sense of how inevitable this is? I mean, is there no negotiation available here?
Well, that's exactly what I think is going to happen. And I think that's what it is that they're laying out a bargaining position. I think it's going to come down to negotiations with the province. They've already had that initial meeting with Premier Smith and Energy Minister Brian Jean. Apparently they were talking about issues like emissions caps, which Premier Smith has said is a de facto production cut. Also exports of LNG to Asia to offset our own emissions, and you know, just some of those kind of issues that are around the just transition that Premier Smith says are her own lines in the sand. So I think basically it's a lot of posturing ahead of some fairly serious, whatever you want to call them, bilateral negotiations, I think Premier Smith called them, which I thought the term was kind of interesting, bilateral negotiations.
Hey, Alberta is a sovereign province. It has certain powers under the Constitution, and the federal government isn't entitled to just usurp those powers. Thank you for this, Shaun. Obviously, this is not a done deal. There is some hope. Certainly, we hope there is hope.
We hope there is hope, yes.
To coin a phrase. Thanks very much for this. I'm sure we'll be back in the next couple of days after the minister has spoken.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.